Thank you so much for my fellow panelists and to the audience for joining us here tonight. My name is Shaznin Daruwalla. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a licensed psychologist at Oregon State University, and I'm also an international practitioner. And looking forward to this conversation. Over to you, Sherry.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sherry Wang. I'm an associate professor. I just got tenured, which is really exciting. I'm an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. And I've been unexpectedly speaking a lot in the media and doing a lot of work on anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in the midst of COVID-19. Happy to be here.
Hi, I am Christina Patterson. I am a psychologist currently in the state of Nevada. I'm also licensed in New Mexico. I'm really excited to be here to join this wonderful panel to talk about xenophobia and racism going on right now in relation to COVID. My pronouns for today are they, them, and theirs. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am Roberto Abreu, and currently I am an assistant professor at Tennessee State University, transitioning to University of Florida starting in August of this coming year. And I wish we were not here having this conversation. However, I'm glad that we are, given everything that's happening around this. So I'm excited for the conversation, for your questions, and welcome everyone.
I think with that, shall we get started with our outline? I think, I don't know if we're going in this particular order, but I'll start us off with a very brief history of anti-Asian racism, and maybe we can move from there to Roberto, you talking about how communities of color across the US can join in solidarity with the Asian community. And then if I remember correctly, in your email, you'd mentioned perhaps Christina doing what white allies can, how they can join in this conversation, and then finally Sherry, you with the self-care. So with my section, I just wanted to say that I'm not a trained historian, I'm just a history buff. So some of the comments and thoughts that I'll be sharing with y'all and probably even reading off my screen is based on the readings that I've done in these past few weeks. Feel free to use the chat box or even Q&A if there's something that I miss or misunderstand. And it's really copy pasting from, various people who are trained historians and kind of using some of their words. So with that, I'll actually start with a quote from Merlin Chokwan-Yoon, who is a historian and an assistant professor at Columbia University School of Public Health. He says that historically in both popular and scientific discourse, contagious disease has often been linked to population groups thought to be outsiders. According to him, associations between germs and immigrants it's not new. What we're seeing today is really this association has been repeated history time and time again. And I'll give you some context for the Asian community later on. And so in general, when there is a climate of xenophobia and racial backlash, it kind of drips down or trickles down to the medical discourse. And given the tensions between US and China, it's not surprising to see how this is happening with the coronavirus. This next section that I'm going to be sharing, mainly the history around anti-Asian racism, is from a town hall that I recently attended. Maybe some of y'all were in this online town hall organized by the People's Collective for Justice and Liberation. And I heard Dr. Jason Chang speak. He works at University of Connecticut's Asian American Studies Institute, and gave a nice what I thought, and yet brief history of the yellow peril, which is, I imagine, a concept that most of us have heard being connected with anti-Asian racism that has resurfaced pretty overtly in this current pandemic. And so according to Chang, this according to Dr. Cheng, this concept of yellow peril is originated in Europe, and one of the main turning points of yellow peril thought was derived from the backlash against the coolie trade. Coolies are laborers or contracted laborers from South Asia, southern China, who were exported to colonial plantations in order to replace emancipated Africans. And between 1830 and 1880s, tens and thousands of male coolies were shipped to the Caribbean and to South America. And poor conditions of the coolies earned them an international reputation of being poor, being dirty, and diseased. And so when places like Cuba and Peru, who had large communities of Chinese coolies, became places of racial denigration, that's when really the yellow peril discourse went international. Coming back to the US, when independent Chinese migration and the coolie trade kind of expanded alongside with each other in the 1800s, all Chinese were considered labor like coolies. And the most I think a lot of tens and thousands of Chinese came to North America mainly because of the gold rush and railroad boom. And while the presence of Chinese people, Chinese labor generated enormous wealth for the white settler class, they were identified as the problem. And mainly because with their presence, the white Protestant promise that the pioneers would find new beginnings in the West turned out to be an empty one. And the Chinese were blamed for that. And so here we have the racial conflict turning into, a class conflict turning into a racial conflict. Really for me highlights, how there's intersectionality along race and class lines. So coming to the present times, the xenophobia that we're seeing happening today in the midst of this pandemic really is not a new one for us. We've been there, we've done that, and it is really deep-rooted. It conjures up some dark moments, for example, in California's past, when fear over Chinese Americans led to pogroms, massacres, and riots. During the late 1800s, the growing Chinese population on the West Coast saw nativist fear over what was seen as loss of jobs. And during the Depression, some of you all might have heard about the 1871 massacre, which resulted, it was in Los Angeles, and it resulted in shootings and lynchings. And at the same time, in San Francisco, there was a two-day pogrom against Chinese Americans in Chinatown. A lot of Chinatowns were burned down and entire communities were expelled. So based on all this, all these events, the US passed racial bans on immigration and naturalization in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And that's an act that, keeps coming up again and again. And it, I think, plays a really important role in immigration history. So this Exclusion Act actually banned Chinese migration to the US for 10 years. And it was enacted as a way to placate worker demands and to soothe prevalent concerns of maintaining white racial purity. And it was actually marked a new era in the racialization of American immigration policy. I think the effects of that we are still feeling today, and it reverberates even today. This act became a new gold standard in settler states, and it spawned the next evolution of the yellow peril idea. I did a little bit of more research into this act, and it seems that it was only repealed in 1943, and even then it's still restricted, or it had some restrictions for Chinese and Asian Americans, such as their ability to own property, and it was finally repealed in 1965. So going back to the 1800s, from the 1880s to 1930s, the post-colonial states within Latin America, as well as other settler states like Australia and Canada, adopted yellow peril concepts and created their own anti-Asian immigration laws. So I think some of this conversation is also giving us a broader context outside of the US, and how the concept of yellow peril is really global. What is interesting, what Dr. Chang talked about, is that racism was more than prejudice with the implementation of these laws. It became a statecraft, and to me, it sounded like it became institutionalized racism. The US pioneered this form of yellow peril racial fear, and it is the core element of American national identity, and it's been proven time and time again. For example, it was proven in the 1930s and 1940s when Japanese Americans were turned into a racial enemy during World War II and pursued by a policy to cage or bomb this population. It came up again in the aftermath of World War II with China's communist revolution in 1949. And it was in this Red Scare environment that the term China virus emerged, describing the spread of communist revolutions in Asia. So kind of maybe continuing with this history, the US's yellow peril ideology also intervened using military force in Korea and Vietnam, because they perceived, the US at that time perceived decolonization and independence going on in these countries as a threat. And because of their interventions and failed campaigns, this generated new diasporas and refugees. During the Cold War, the US passed massive immigration reforms in 1965, lifting racial and national origin bans in the Hart-Celler Act. And this created new pathways for Asians and Latinx immigrants, and they, formed new communities within the U.S. However, at the same time, with the influx of immigrants from Asia and Latin America, were also perceived by white Americans as the front lines of a foreign invasion. Coming to maybe closer to our times and our lifetime, the September 11th attacks were a most recent revision to the yellow peril discourse, according to Dr. Chang, and it has defined South Asians, Arabs, Muslims as the new enemy aliens. So as I start to wind down my section, a couple of things that Jason Chang talked about was that yellow peril is a core feature of US history rooted in imperialism and exploitation and capitalist warfare. Yellow peril discourse uses salient ethnicities to cast all Asians as threats. We know that within the Asian community, Asian American community, there's a lot of heterogeneity across nationalities, ethnicities, and yet US power sees it as a monolithic race. And then the third one, that the tools of the racial state are revised and recycled, which is to say that mechanisms of oppression for Black and Brown and Indigenous people have been used against Asian Americans, and those developed to oppress Asian Americans have been used against Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. So just in kind of trying to end this onset and what we are seeing with COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the racist response that has shown up, is really fitting in with the ready-made story of yellow peril in the US. And racism in the context of this pandemic has, some outcomes. One is that the people do not seek care at the appropriate times because they fear being attacked. Two, it shifts away our conversations from, scientific inquiry and investigation into a biological reality, towards the social construct of race. And third, it gives a false sense of immunity, thinking that, oh yeah, I'm immune from it, or I can't get it, or I can't contract it, and it only afflicts certain people. So with that, I think my closing remark, something that Dr. Chang talked about is I'm really happy that we are coming together in this panel and excited to talk to the audience about how we can challenge xenophobia that has started showing up pretty overtly again in the context of this pandemic. Because according to Dr. Chang, struggle to survive the pandemic, we're all struggling to survive it. However, we are also in it all together in how the pandemic is remembered. And we really need to build that foundation now. I think Dr. Chang really spoke to a sense of urgency about building that foundation, because we can control the narrative around it and we can control how it is remembered.
Thank you so much, Shaznin. So I'm reading in the chat that maybe I need to speak a little louder. Can you hear me a little better? So I'm going to speak a little louder and also get closer to my computer. I didn't want to walk away and put earbuds. So in thinking about what my role is, not just in this webinar, but during this pandemic and during this time where there is so much going on, right? Like it is very easy for us to get lost since we're all suffering to one way or another, to get lost on if we dig deeper, who are those groups who are being marginalized the most during this pandemic, right, and during this crisis, right? And I think one of the groups that we can all identify are our Asian siblings, right? So in thinking about this, I was like, okay, so how would I like my other, folks of color to respond if I were experiencing something like this? How would I like my other, siblings of color to show up for me, right? So I kind of wrote down some ideas that I would love to share with you, and I would also love to hear what you all have to say as well. So I think one of the first things that comes to mind for me, which it sounds so simple, right? But in all this time, it is very easy to overlook, and that is checking out with your friends, and especially your Asian friends, and seeing what they need in ways that you can show up for them, right? Even if it's just a text message, a phone call, right? To say, I see you, I hear you, and although we're all in this together, I see that you specifically are being affected, or one of the groups that is being affected the most during these times, right? I think the way systems of oppression work, it is very easy for us to look the other way and say, well, but we're all in this together, right? Or I'm being affected too, and that is true, right? And who are the folks who are experiencing extra layers of that oppression, right? I think also it's important to get the facts, right? And during this time, I feel like every time I open social media or see something, there's something new that we're learning about this, right? And that includes new ways that racism and oppression reinvents itself, right? So I think knowing the facts is important, and that way we are able to call it out whenever in ways that we can, right? And like I said, denial is part of the racist narrative, right? Of do not look that way because we're having to experience all of these other pieces, right? So forget that part. We don't have to talk about racism. We don't have to talk about how this very specific group is being oppressed, and the system will function that way, right? So, okay, I will move away from the microphone a little bit. I think also it's important to recognize and know that we're all connected in oppression, right? Like I was saying, this is time in where the system would aim to divide, right? And to say, well, don't look at your, Asian folks. How about you, right? So take care of you, and really what we're doing is taking care of anyone of each other, right? We follow that narrative. Try to disrupt that narrative in ways that we can, right? I mean, it takes what, like 15 or one day on the social media to call it whatever, label it a racist term, right? And everybody is referring to this as such, right? So in which ways can we disrupt that, even if it is with the other people in our lives, right? Um, and so those are like, I guess, the major takeaway points that I would just like to share, and I would love to hear what other folks would like to contribute. I mean, ways that they have, you know, especially other folks of color, have been able to disrupt or show for their Asian siblings.
Hello. Before I jump in and talk about white folks and what we can do, there is a question that I wanted to see if anybody on the panel wanted to respond to before I kind of moved on, looking at quote unquote some of the discrimination and prejudice that exists between communities of color. For example, the anti-Chinese sentiment that is so salient amongst South Asians, many of whom subscribe to the belief that this is a Chinese virus. So before I move on, I wanted to see if anybody wanted to respond to that.
I can speak a little bit to that because I think this really speaks to the diversity of the Asian American community, or the Asian term, and how much that encompasses, and how much I think we also need to distinguish racism from nationalism, because those are two very important pieces, and a lot of this has been nationalism too. And so if you think about the history and how long broadly Asian history has been, we have so many wars and battles within the larger Asian community, right? So we're not like one big happy family. And I think just because we're all being attacked, it doesn't necessarily unite us. And it can, but it historically hasn't. And so I think in thinking about that, and I've had lots of folks actually come and ask me about that, of saying like, you know, I'm Vietnamese. Somebody has told me that recently. I'm Vietnamese, and my family actually, they refer to it as a Chinese virus. You know, we're Asian, and we are actually targeted in the same way that people who are perceived as Chinese are being targeted these days, and yet my family members keep using the term Chinese virus. They don't see what's wrong with that. So I think even within our communities, we do this to each other. So I think it's important to recognize that as a person, a Chinese person, so I identify as Taiwanese and yet even as a person like that, I am very aware of my racism, my nationalism, that when all of this first started out, that I was very aware then when another Asian looking person would sneeze or cough. I have the same vision. And then I have to check myself. I have to think to myself, did I just kind of pull back because that person looks Asian? And if this person were white, and that speaks to the race part, right? If this person were white, would I have the same reaction? That's the first question I ask myself. The second question I ask myself is, if this person were, in my perception, if I thought they were white and American, would I have the same reaction? And that's about the racism and the xenophobia, which is the anti-immigrant piece, where we even, I think, as Asians, or any other racial ethnic minority group, may look to one another and judge and deem, are you American? Are you of the same national background as me? So I think we all have a lot of assumptions. We have histories. We have history that's very active too, of who our family members may or may not be okay with us socializing with or marrying. I mean, those pieces are still very real. And so I think that just because we are all being maybe attacked in similar ways by outsiders, it doesn't actually mean that we are necessarily forgiving or forgetting our past histories.
Okay, thank you for answering that, Sherry. Okay, I am going to be thoughtful of time and move us a little bit forward, but please continue to ask questions. And we have some time reserved at the end to kind of field questions again. I want to talk about white folks and kind of what we can do, particularly within the realm of the United States, since that is where I'm coming from and kind of where I understand the more cultural, societal, and political machinations that are occurring. And so what I want to highlight is a few different pieces regarding ways that white folks can move forward in this. And as the group with power in the United States currently, the one that's holding the most power and the most privilege, that we have an opportunity and an obligation to move forward in a way that helps our communities of color, and particularly in this time, our Asian and Asian American community, particularly since we have a top-down systemic issue, right? We have our president who's calling this a Chinese virus. We have this spreading not just in our conversations between each other and family members, but also on a very broad socio-political scale that we are working on. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what I'm calling proactive steps. So things that we are initiating, things that we're taking upon ourselves to do instead of reacting to a situation that is occurring. So to echo the sentiments of what Sherry was just talking about, is the first thing that I'm requesting that any kind of white person do is check in with yourself. What biases, what assumptions and prejudices are coming up for you during this time? Are you also noticing that when you're around an Asian or an Asian American person, or a perceived Asian American person, what is your initial response? Is it to move away from a person? Is it to shield yourself if they look like they might be what you think is ill or sick or something along those lines? Are you distancing yourself from a person? Are you distancing yourself from the community? And so in order to move forward, we need to be aware of where we're currently at that particular time. So that's my first step for you. The other things that I am going to recommend is to actually initiate providing information. And so with that, you have social media, you have emails, you have whatever your work situation is, whatever your social situation is that if you initiate providing informed, legitimate information to people within your circles, you have the chance to kind of head this off before it kind of turns into something else. So if you're only referring to something as COVID-19 or coronavirus, looks a lot different than not referring to it at all. And COVID-19 is a very specifically designed name, right, to stand for coronavirus disease 19 for the 2019 year. That started. It's a very neutral name, that it doesn't discuss where it originated, it doesn't discuss any of those pieces. And so using the scientific name in these initiations can also help to start that this is the appropriate name for it. This is what we are working towards. And so having that initial piece of how you want to present information going forward, and present factual information as it comes out. And of course, information is changing regularly as we get more information, but think about how you're presenting it and initiate that part of it. And then preempt by discussing the racism inherent in it, right? So white folks have this really wonderful privilege, and by wonderful I mean awful and worked in and just innate into it, that we don't actually have to address this if we don't really want to, because it's not affecting us at the same level. That's the inherent part of privilege in it, which means that if we start the discussion about racism, we can actually narrate it a little bit different within the white communities of how it's being talked about. So when I talk to other white folks, I am quick to talk about what is going on regarding racism and xenophobia in the communities, and talk about kind of the awfulness and how that's impacting my clients that I work with in a clinical setting, how it's impacting friends, how it's impacting broader communities, how it's impacting public health, etc. And so when we start saying that this is something that's occurring, we're acknowledging the real existence of what is happening, but we're also saying it's a conversation that it's appropriate to have, we need to have, and that we're not going to back down from having when these conversations come up, which is incredibly important that we put ourselves on that line. The other parts that I want to talk about regarding being proactive is in relation to settings and different positions. Psychology is quite a broad field. We all have different jobs within it. I am a clinician, and so one of the things that I'm doing is checking in with all of my clients on different levels. So if I have a client who identifies as Asian, Asian American, and I am from Las Vegas, we have quite a large Asian American population here, I'm checking in with them. How are you? How are you doing? Are you being impacted by this in certain ways? How can I continue to support you, not just with our typical clinical work, but also what else is going on, and validating those experiences if they're occurring for them. And then with my white clients, what I'm also doing is talking to them about, like, oh yes, there's been a lot of racism and xenophobia happening. Here's kind of information, because I have a lot of scared and uncertain people who are sitting in their rooms. Now I guess we're doing telehealth, they're not sitting across from me, who are also confused and unsure. And the same conversation is also occurring with my other clients of color, of different races and ethnicities and nationalities, to continue to figure out how I can support them through this as well. But that we're naming it and we're bringing it to the therapy room as well. And so as I think about that, you can do that in teaching, you can do that in administrative meetings, you can do that in various situations where you're checking in, kind of as Roberto was saying, how are you? I notice you, I see you. And also on the other side, the other community saying, I also see you, and here's some certain pieces that we kind of need to address. And that also goes for, you know, family conversations. I'm sure a lot of us right now, like Sherry was saying, we're having conversations where our families are perhaps not social distancing, or perhaps they're also engaging in conversations that encourage racism and xenophobia, and that we have an obligation to step in, because even when we're outside of our clinical spotlight or our professional spotlight or whatever teaching spotlights that we have in our arenas of work, we are also still educators and clinicians and all of these in our private situations as well. And we can use the same skills to continue to have those conversations with our family and friends. Family and friends are not exempt from these conversations. And then I want to talk a little bit about some reactive pieces as well. And this is what happens when something occurs. What happens when somebody calls the COVID-19 the Chinese virus, or they say something about immigration and various pieces like that. And this definitely derives from work within the racism and bystander effect communities, particularly recently with microaggression research, which is where my research has historically been. So I'm definitely taking some of the notes from all of those researchers. And in particular, I'm going to highlight this from a microinterventions article that came out last year by Sue Al-Saidi, Awad, Glacier, Kaye, and Mendez. So I want to highlight the 4 steps that they gave, because I think they're wonderful steps that we can use no matter what the situation actually is. The first step is to make the invisible visible, meaning we name it. And if we don't name it, we allow it to continue to permeate and move through in ways that can be pretty harmful to our communities. And so one of the things I want us to think about is, how do we do that? How do we speak to it? And sometimes you can use it in different ways. You can just kind of say, oh, that sounded a little bit like, what just happened? You called it this, right? You can kind of talk about the feeling it evokes. You can name it and say, oh, it's actually called the COVID-19. That's the name of it. That's the scientific name. You can also speak to it. I tend to use a lot of humor and a little bit of sarcasm. It's my own brand. Not everybody has to, but I tend to do a lot of like, oh, I didn't realize we were doing it this way, or kind of calling it in a way that feels a little bit less on the spot, but allows it to bring to attention, which leads to part 2, which is to disarm, which is, how do we bring it around in a way that says that this is also not okay? So how do we disarm the situation from allowing it to grow, which can also melt into point number 3, which is educate. Sometimes they can be one and the same, and sometimes they're separate steps, which is along the lines of, yeah, we actually call it COVID-19 because it stands for coronavirus disease starting in 2019, and it's a pretty neutral name. And when we use things like Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, what we're doing is totally pinning it onto one racial or nationality group, ethnicity, et cetera, whatever words we use. And that's actually not accurate. I mean, you know, it's kind of all over the world at this point, and we're working on trying to stop the spread. You can also educate on the harm that it could increase discrimination, and what discrimination can do is harm these communities. As we saw yesterday, I'm sure all of us saw the really awful news that a family was attacked by a person who thought that they were trying to spread the disease, and it was an Asian American family, and a little child was a part of that. And so we have that responsibility. And step 4 on microinterventions is to call for help when you need it, meaning if you're just not sure, check in with people that you trust. Seek, if you're white, seek other white folks to help support you in these situations. Obviously, you can seek communities of color, and also we don't want to overburden them because they're already taxing disproportionately to try to protect and self-care for them and their own communities as well. And so we want to be able to reach out in ways that make sense. And this is all very quick, I know, but what I want to do is wrap it up with a couple of points that go across all of this, which is if an Asian or Asian American person or community is talking to you about their experiences, we are not here to question that. We're not here to question the veracity of these statements and their experiences. We're here to support and validate. And that as white folks, what I genuinely believe is that we have an obligation to work with other white folks, right? It's not my responsibility, and it's an inappropriate role for me to presume to know how to help a community that's being impacted by racism and xenophobia. But what I can do is talk to other white folks about what's going on. This is an incredibly important piece so that I can take off that burden from communities that are already overtaxed. And with that, what that also means is just because I'm taking on a role to help within my own community of white folks, I'm also not speaking for these communities. I'm not speaking for them. I'm not speaking over them. And I want to be really thoughtful, because white privilege and white supremacy has this really insidious way of recentering it around ourselves, right? And so even talking about our own awareness and bringing it into what we can do actually also recenters it around whiteness, right? We have Roberto, who kind of did a broad community of color, and here I am as a sole person talking about the white community generally. So there's already kind of a disproportionate pull towards that. And so we want to be thoughtful that we're not speaking over a community or for a community. And then the very last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to pass it off, is what's the word I'm looking for? We also don't want to be white saviors. These communities need us to support them, uplift them, but they do not need us to rescue them. They are already a community and groups of people that have power and voice, and they don't need us to pretend to do that. What we need to do is work within our community to kind of shape it up, and then we provide support and resources and funding and all of these other really important commodities to get and amplify the communities that are already doing this work. We don't need to do it for them. Okay, I know that Sherry is next, but it looks like she has disappeared from my screen, so I don't know where she is. And so, yes, I think we'll look to see if we have questions as well.
We are trying to get Sherry back. Hi, everyone. My name's Annalise Singh. My pronouns are she, her, hers, they, them, theirs. And as we try to get Sherry back, really curious about what the panel has to say about, I don't know if you saw Dr. Abreu American University, and I'll drop a link to his article. It's really great in the Atlantic. It's called Why Don't We Know Who the Coronavirus Victims Are? I think it's really interesting that it's been on my mind, as I've seen racism and xenophobia increase towards folks of Asian heritage, that there's all this other embedded racism that I think is going to come out that we haven't even seen yet. We know what happens to people of color, to folks from immigrant backgrounds, to folks from asylum and refugee or US controlled documents who are undocumented. We know what happens to these groups. And so when we don't have this racial demographic data, I'm really concerned that the people of color are overrepresented as victims or survivors. So I was curious, we got Sherry back, but I wondered if the panel could quickly respond to that. What do you think about the fact that we don't know much about the racial ethnic identities of people who are living with coronavirus and dying with coronavirus?
I wonder if that's that lack of transparency and communication is yet another tool to use as a way to perpetuate the narrative that might be working for the racial state. So just because we are withholding information and we kind of just plant, a little bit of information and just then move away, it just takes on a life of its own, and we're just going to see how the racism and xenophobia continues to evolve and not give any corrective or clarifying information. So I think there's someone else on the panel.
Well, if I could say something about infectious disease, actually. So one of the reasons I've spoken so much about COVID-19 is actually because of the work I've been doing with HIV. And the more you know about HIV and other diseases, then you really think about the history of infectious diseases and how they have always been racialized against people of color, right? So I'm thinking about SARS and bird flu. That really triggered a lot of anti-China and then later anti-Asian sentiments. We have swine flu, which was against Mexicans, but not just Mexican immigrants in particular. You have the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which was kind of nicknamed as a Muslim illness, and MERS, that's the name for it. MERS has been used as for the World Health Organization now as what not to call a disease, because the geographical naming of it, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, made it seem like it's for people there in that part of the world. Ebola is Black racism. I mean, so infectious disease has always been an issue where, if you think about it, we don't know how it spread initially, probably, and when it does spread, it's really not based on race or geography. Like, disease does not discriminate on the basis of what we look like, and yet we have always historically racialized it against people of color, against LGBTQ people. And so knowing what I know about HIV and the work that I do with HIV, I know that we actually have biomedical treatments for HIV, right? You can actually, there's preventative medicine you can take to not have HIV. And yet we're still seeing that Black and brown communities, trans communities, gay communities of color are the ones that are not able to access services, not able to access the drugs that are going to be life-saving. And so that's not to say that any doctor goes into the field of infectious disease wanting to be racist, but that we're all racist. We all come from a racist system. And so why is it then that for people of color who are asking for medication, there's an assumption of like, well, if I give you this treatment, you might abuse it. But we don't think that when it comes to white men. Right, we kind of give medicine easily in ways that we question it for people of color. So I don't think actually COVID-19 is that unique. I think it actually fits in with our history and with our treatment of othering people. And the others are not only just different from us, but they're dirty. We don't want to touch them. We want to ostracize them. And if anything, let's burn them, which we have seen too in our history of how that's happened. So I wonder if, Christina, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, no, go for it. I was going to say, do you want to continue? Because when I had finished, we had lost you for a minute, and so you came in, answered a question wonderfully. So it is your turn.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'll jump in. I'm sorry, I lost connection for a bit. So my role is really thinking about self-care, and I think that self-care looks very unique these days for all of us globally, given how much ambiguity there is, how disruptive our lives are now. But I also think that for Asian Americans, this is a very unique time of being fearful in all of these ways that everyone else is fearful in terms of our physiological health and well-being. But there's an added component now too of going outside and being attacked just on the basis of what you look like. You know, Asian countries are actually doing so much better with the management of the disease because of public health practices, including wearing a mask. And my family in Taiwan constantly call me and say, do you have a mask? Why are you not wearing a mask when you walk the dog? Why aren't you wearing a mask when you go to school? And I have to explain to them, I cannot wear a mask, or even if I do, then I have to risk my life really, because I could literally be cut. I could be physically attacked for wearing a mask. So I have to choose between how I protect myself in some ways, expose myself to a disease, or risk actually being violently and then horrifically attacked. And so I think there's physical, psychological, emotional stress that everyone is dealing with, but Asian Americans at a different level of true fear for our physical safety. And some of the things that I think for psychologists, our role in advocating for our community is that I'm hearing activists, very well-intentioned activists, say to Asian communities, you gotta speak up. We gotta speak up when bad things happen to us, when racist, xenophobic statements are happening, when hate crimes are happening. I completely agree with that, and I really wanna add the and part. And I think it becomes a problem if we are forcing people to have to speak up when they're not ready to. And this is, I think, where psychology plays a role, because if we're wanting to change things in a social movement way, that goal is different than attending to an individual's health and well-being first. And we know from trauma literature, so if you are a victim of a trauma, right? I'm thinking about victims and survivors of sexual assault, for example. We don't tell them, you got to go report to somebody right now, because that actually can be very re-victimizing. And so for me, as I hear, and I'm getting more involved with Asian American activists speaking up about COVID-19, I can't help but hesitating a little bit and saying, well, hold on, we want to encourage people to feel empowered to be able to report. But I don't want to shame people so that if somebody does not report because they are so rattled, because they're so shaken, because they haven't recovered actually from what happened yet, I don't want them to feel like they've done something wrong because they didn't represent their community. And so I just think that there's so much ambiguity and fear right now, and part of it is a distrust in our government. I think everybody feels that way too, but I think for immigrants in particular, and people who have grown up in countries outside of just the US, for example, we're used to seeing different types of news. Like I never rely on one news source, and I certainly don't rely on one from one particular country. So I actually think one of the strengths that we have as immigrants and people of color is that we have always known that we don't trust one news source or one government. We hear it from different perspectives. And so some of the things that I've heard too, the recommendations have been, limit your media exposure, don't watch as much news. And part of me kind of reacts to that a little bit, like, but it's not a choice for me to, because the people whose faces I see affected look like mine. So how can I not care? And when I look through my social media, and it's not necessarily about health necessarily, it's really just about Asian American news and what's happening to people who look like me, or Asian news globally, I'm seeing COVID-19. So I can't not expose myself to it. That is a privilege, actually, to be able to turn off the news and not care, because it hit Asia first. And so I have family members there. So I disagree with that. I disagree with this blanket statement of let's not watch the news to protect ourselves. I think it is important to be informed. And I think that's important as social justice advocates too, that we need to be informed. But then to be able to have to decide then what we trust, I think that's a different story, right? But being rattled by like, well, CNN is saying this, and Fox News is saying this, and MSNBC is saying this, but the news from Canada is saying something different, like that, we have to deal with that ambiguity. And I think for many Americans, that is the first time that we're having to be like, our government doesn't tell the truth. And our government withholds information also. So I mean, I'm all for critiquing governments for how they're not doing things well. And I think it's also important to highlight that we can't critique China's government. China's government has clearly lied. Our government lies too. But anti-government is not the same as anti-people. And I think that is a really important distinction to make, that we can all be critical of governments and politicians, and we want to call them out. And I think that language is important. Calling them out, because that has a little bit of shame to it, of being like, do your job, look out for the people, you're elected to do this, so you need to do this. But I don't think we should call each other out. And that's about the climate of safety for each other. I encourage we call each other in. And that's really coming from a place of kindness and trust in one another of, I don't think you meant to microaggress and you did it by accident. I'm gonna give you the benefit of the doubt. So I'm gonna educate you a little bit, but I also have to take the risk, right? And being vulnerable with you to tell you what you said really hurt my feelings. And so that is actually an effort to be closer to you when I'm willing to come to you to say, you know, when you said this about Asian people, or when you said this about this disease, it actually hurt my feelings. That I hope people don't necessarily hear that as a shaming thing. I think there's a way to talk about it where we're saying, I value this relationship enough to work through it. Because if I didn't value this relationship and I didn't care for you, the easier thing for me to do is walk away. Dust my hands off and be like, I'm done with you. I never need to deal with you again. But the fact that I'm coming to you and talking to you about it, it means I'm investing in our relationship. And so I think for Asian Americans and for any community, an individual who's being victimized and targeted, it is not our job to have to educate. I think that is a crucial piece to think about. That it's important to have allies who will advocate. And I think, therefore, one of the things we should ask for is we need to ask for bystander intervention training. If we're going to ask Asian Americans to stand up and report more hate crimes, we need to ask bystanders to also do the same. Like, if we only ask Asian Americans to report on anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, what we're doing then is we're saying, what's your problem? So you should find the resolution, right? And that's not how change works. Just like with Black Lives Matter, if only Black people spoke up, this would not actually, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. We needed Asians, we needed Latinx communities, we needed so many communities to come together to say, you can't do that to our black siblings, just like we are needing our other siblings to come and say, hey, that's not okay to say to an Asian person or about an Asian person. So I think it's important for us to ask for help where it feels empowering for us to decide whatever we want to do, right? That we empower one another. If we want to report, we can report. If we want to document it, we want to document it. If we want to just go to our room and cry and not talk to somebody for a while, and that's going to recharge and refuel us, let us do that too and offer that to one another. So I've written an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle a little bit about kind of how we can respond to the virus of racism, and I can share that in the chat box later too. But what it is really that let people cope however they're coping without saying there is one way to deal with it, because there is no one way. So I'll stop here because I want to be mindful of time.
Thank you so much, Sherry, Christina, Shaznin, and Roberto. Such a great discussion and so many just important reminders. We have a few questions that have come up. One is, how do you approach folks on social media? Many folks use rhetoric that's used by the president, which is unscientific and propagates further xenophobia and racism. And I saw another question about where did the term Chinese virus, or where did the virus originate? If you've been following the science around COVID-19, you'll see that they've long already identified that it probably, they don't know the origins, right? And so they're doing the best that they can. But I think I really appreciated this panel kind of pointing out that over time in history, with a bubonic plague, blamed on the Jews, Jewish communities, typhoid, blamed on the Irish, HIV, those Haitian Americans, swine flu with Mexican Americans. I mean, it's gone on and on with West Africans and Ebola. So thank you for those reminders. How do you challenge this sentiment on social media, which is such a fast moving target?
I don't want to dominate the space, but I actually have recently become pretty active in social media because I think it's so important for us to reach our communities. So I've started like a professional Instagram page, and I have been active on my Twitter page, really actually to make these comments, right? So to the White House wrote something about like, it came from China. And so I thought really long and hard about kind of what kind of image I want to present. And part of it was I wanted to give the facts. Things like, actually, a lot of the diseases you're talking about came from the US, and yet there's a privilege in us never naming a disease a white person's disease, a white American disease. And so I think we can drop facts and do it with attitude, right? To be like, bam, mic drop. That's how I feel after every one of my tweets in my own head. But I want to be really mindful that I'm not, being derogatory, or that I'm not being insulting, because I think part of what we're doing is we're also role modeling to our communities how to stand up for ourselves and give facts in deliverable ways. I mean, tweeting is so hard because you have to say it in such a short blurb. So how to do it in a way where people, the regular lay person can understand the key gist without us using a bunch of jargon, and really conveying it in a way that's respectful and kind. And if it's a call-in, people can feel the kindness of us saying, let's come together and do it together. And if it's meant to be a call out, which sometimes it is meant to be a call out, I think it's still important for it to be professional, because people are watching not only the content of what you say, but the process of how you say it too. So I think that's actually, that's work, that's a skill set that we all have to work to build.
Thank you, Sherry. And there's a request to drop your Instagram handle into the chat box. And I dropped a link to the Division 17 Counseling Psychology page where you can see some of the articles where Sherry's been interviewed in. Christina, this question is for you from Gloria. You mentioned deep racialized financial inequality fueled by white supremacy and nationalism in the US. What are kind of recommendations, actually this is for everyone, about how white psychologists, trainees might move their money and encourage others to support racial and immigrant justice in the time of COVID? Actually, let's just let the white person, Christina, take this one.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important question, because one of the things that I think is actually incredibly important that white folks do is move our money to support communities of color. And I think we move this in different ways. I think there's an individual piece where we move our own individual monies. What organizations do we give to, whether these are local or national to international organizations, right? And these can vary from professional organizations to outside of professional organizations as well. So local communities. So the things that I would recommend is that people look at on a very personal level is what's happening in your community, whether it's your city, your state, your region, because there are things happening. There are always communities moving and grassroots organizations. And I encourage being able to give money in ways that make sense to local communities, because they're the ones who are on the ground and aware of what that community needs. And so what ends up happening with white folks who give money is we tend to give it in a way that we still kind of dominate and dictate how people spend their money, that we want it spent in a certain way because we think this is the important way, which is very paternalizing, very patronizing, and very white supremacy, and other ways that we are telling a community what's important to them and how to spend the money. And so I think local grassroots is actually a significant way to give back, because they're the community who knows what your community needs most. And then that also includes national and international organizations as well that have larger grassroots movements. And I will also say within professional arenas, there are ways to move your money, personal money, into certain things like supporting scholarships for communities that tend to be underrepresented. So donating to the different divisions like Division 45, Division 44, Division 35, Division 17, et cetera, that have all of these different divisions that support marginalized communities and communities of color. The Asian American Psychology Association is another one as well. We're looking specifically at Asian American groups, and scholarships to support professional advancements such as conference attendances, scholarships to promote their research, those types of pieces. Another thing that I think we need to do if we're looking within our field is that we need to actually start figuring out how we want to shift our organizations to represent. So within organizations, one of the conversations that different divisions are having, and I am on the executive board of Division 44, so I can speak to some of the conversations we're having, is we tend to want to promote parties that we don't see in our ranks very often, right? Our marginalized communities, even within Division 44, but we're not very good at holding on to them because we haven't really figured out how to fight racism and xenophobia and heterosexism and cissexism and all of these things in our ranks. And so we lose members that provide valuable voices that could shift this. And so with that also goes money, right? Who are we giving money to promote their research so that those are, in our field, we deem that as valuable, right? We deem that as kind of really the cream of the crop. If you're a researcher putting out awesome research, your voice gets lifted to the top versus people who might be on the ground doing community advocacy and other pieces. And then I also think that there needs to be money shifted in the way that we're talking about it from large systemic pieces of this country, in particular, if we're talking about the United States. What is NIH funding? What is APA funding? What are all these large organizations, SAMHSA, NIDA, all of them? What are they funding and what are they seeing as valuable? Because it's still coming through the lens of white supremacy. So money needs to be shifted in a variety of different ways, both personal and large money regarding professional and systemic issues. And that goes to things like vote, be involved, engage. We have a civic duty, both to our country, our state, our local area, but also our profession, right? As being educated individuals, we have a privilege to use our training to advocate for these pieces. And so money all around needs to shift.
Thank you so much. So any closing thoughts? We are right at 7:01, but just wanted to give each of you just about 20, 30 seconds to just kind of share any final thoughts that you have had. I see our APA past president, Rosie Davis, thought this panel was excellent. We agree with her and always glad to see her in the audience. So Roberto, let's start with you. Closing thoughts.
I think that it's important to know and to stay engaged. I think that's really important. I think a lot of things that have happened, including I presume, including this, is that it becomes the new normal. Therefore, we're like, oh, it's just another day in talking about this, right? So I think it's important to stay engaged and be like actively engaged and not just like passively moving through the news and assist racist narratives to come up to challenge them.
Thank you. Shaznin?
I will say that to my Asian siblings, I see you, I hear you, I am engaged and I'm in this with you. And to my other POC communities, please help. And to my white siblings, please also stay engaged and step up and use your privilege.
Awesome. Christina?
I will once say thank you for everybody on this panel. You were amazing. I enjoyed learning from you, and I will continue to say, similar to what is being espoused, stay engaged. It's an incredible privilege for us to shut off the media, to walk away, to say it's a problem for another day, particularly as white folks. And so it's really pertinent that we particularly stay on the movement towards an anti-racist effort, because if you're not engaging in anti-racism and anti-xenophobia, you're perpetuating the quo and perpetuating it. And we need to be able to help support our communities by fighting in ways that is against white supremacy, because we have that power and privilege.
Thank you. Sherry?
I would just like to conclude with, I think intersectionality is that we're talking about the Asian community today, but different fragments of Asian communities are actually more marginalized than others, thinking about older populations, immunologically compromised Asian communities, people who are not able-bodied. And so we're talking about Asians right now, but as we see in the news, certain regions of the country are being affected even more. So I think about the privilege. We all have privilege in some ways, and that we should all ally for one another. And then there's gonna be times when we cannot, right? And I think that's the part that's about compassion. We may not be able to speak up all the time. We may not be able to watch the news every second. So allowing ourselves to recognize moments of intersectionality when we need to take a step back and rest, and then come back in. But let yourself rest, because this is a marathon, this is not a sprint. And so for us to really be able to help each other out, we really have to engage in good self-care to be able to do that.
And Sherry, still, what is your Instagram handle? People are wanting to follow you on Instagram.
Oh, sure. Yeah, my Instagram and Twitter is Dr. Sherry C. Wang.
And yeah, thank you for leading a lot of this work. It's been awesome. Linda shared that the American Psychological Foundation will be announcing 2 grants soon focused on COVID-19 in the next couple of days. You can check out the APF webpage. You know, I want to thank our panelists for this awesome discussion tonight, and thank all of you as attendees. We had a lot of folks here, and I think, you know, for a time when I think people are really zoomed out and say, I can't go to another webinar, one thing that struck me is every time there's been a webinar or a Zoom meeting about racism and xenophobia, it has been at or over capacity. And I think that tells us that these types of venues are really important right now. So when we talk about being burned out with technology, let's just kind of trouble that a little bit with this is actually a medium that's starting a lot of conversations. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, we have an opportunity in counseling psychology, you know, I gotta say this, to build the counseling psychology of liberation. Liberation is all about getting free. And what that means is prevention. So imagine if we were trained in our counseling psychology and other mental health professions to not only know our history of the politics of prejudice, but that we were prepared. That is true prevention, and that is true public health. So I thank each of the panelists for reminding us of things that we can do, and just of the sweet reminders of self-care and interdependent community care. I wish all of you the best in your continued advocacy. I wish everyone to stay as healthy as you can and safe as you can, but also to stay really vigilant and ask, when are we going to hear these demographics about who is being impacted, and how are we continuing to have an intersectional conversation about ableism and ageism as we move through the times of COVID-19. I wish you all good evening and take good care.